Okay, I'm going to show you how I've drawn this image, break it down into steps that are way easier to follow than you might imagine, so that you can have a go, create this, and amaze yourself. Okay, so as explained in the intro, I'm going to break this down into steps so that you'll learn not only the painting process and techniques, but also about the app that I'm using, Procreate. But that isn't to say that you couldn't use a different app on a different tablet and still follow along. Having said that, within Procreate, I'm using their default A4 canvas, which is 297 by 210 millimeters at 300 dpi. And in terms of the colors, I'm using, again, within their default lists, the sRGB code, the one that ends in 2.1. And then in terms of brushes, I'm using just the default brushes that come within Procreate for free. And that is going to be within airbrushing, the soft brush and the medium hard brush. Within inking, I'm going to use the Studio Pen. Within elements, I'll use the clouds brush. And then within organic, I'm going to use the rainforest brush and, well, maybe the snow gum brush as well. And that should do. In terms of the colors, well, I've already pre-selected a color palette. And each of these colors, if you tap on them and go to the value section, you can see here there's a section called hexadecimal. It has a code. Well, each of these codes is listed down in the video description. You just need to copy and paste them into this box one at a time and press enter. The color will appear up here, and then you can just tap it into the color palette for yourself. Or next to the color codes in the description is a link that takes you to my Patreon page where you can download the color file for free to save you some time. And Patreon is also the place where you can go and support this channel and gain access to exclusive content such as extended versions of most of these tutorials. I'd like to say a massive thank you to those people who do support me over at Patreon. It makes an enormous difference to my ability to keep this channel going and keep creating new content. And with all of that said and done, we're going to get started. So the first thing I'm going to do with my canvas is rotate it to the portrait orientation. Then I'm going to go to my colors. I'm going to choose the first color on the top row, and I'm going to drag it from the color circle into the canvas and release, and it flood fills. Now please be aware that the colors may look a little bit different on your screen, or rather I should say your two screens, so you'll be watching it on a device and then you'll be creating it on your iPad, and there might be a little bit of difference between the two colors. Much of that is down to the camera that I use and also possibly the screen settings that you've got on as well. But as long as you've copied down the codes or downloaded the file, then you are using the correct colors, so don't worry about that. I'm going to create another layer, layer 2, and I'm going to use the soft brush within airbrushing. I'm going to go for the second color on the top row. I'm going to put the size pretty big. I'm going to put it at 70% and 100% opacity. And then I'm going to imagine the sun's coming in from this side. So I'm going to do a circle of light over here. Just creep it along this way 3 or 4 times like that. Then I'm going to go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur that in 100% and deselect. Now it possibly may look a little bit severe at this point, so we can easily go back to the N, tap on it and just turn the strength of that down. So I'm probably going to put it at about 50% for now. We can always go back and ramp that up if it's necessary. We're going to go back to our layers and create a new layer, layer 3. Now we're going to start peppering in some clouds into our scene. So I'm going to go to the elements, clouds brush, and I'm going to go back to the colors. I'm going to use this color first, which is the darkest of the 3 at the end. So the third color. And with the clouds brush, I'm probably going to put it to about 30% size and about 50% opacity. And I'm just going to start tapping in some shapes. Maybe I'll put the opacity up even. It's always better to start a little bit more subtle, just in case you're not going to be happy with it. And this center area is going to be obscured by the tree as well. So have some cloud through there. Maybe just turn that down now to about 5. And then we can go in there and just be a bit more controlled with some of the shapes it's suggested. I can just bring them out a little bit more. This is not something I need to spend very long on. Just bring out a couple of those shapes a little bit more. Not much at all. You can always go to that layer, slide and duplicate it, and it ramps up what we already have. Slide and duplicate it again. It just makes them a bit more solid. Then I can take those 3 layers or 3 versions and pinch them together back into one layer, like so. Then I'm going to tap on that layer, put on the alpha lock, and then going to switch to the airbrushing, soft brush again, and I'm going to go for the next color, so the 4th color on the top row. I'm going to put the size, maybe about 10%, and the strength pretty down, maybe about 20. And I'm just going to start bringing in some highlights now. So this cloud. Over on this side, again, this is where the sun is coming from, so it's going to impact on this edge more. Makes sense. Then we can go to the last color, which is the 5th color on the top row. Maybe turn it down a little bit, put it at 5%. Still at the, actually no, we'll put it up to 30% strength. And we can just create some brighter, stronger highlights here as well. And it's pretty subtle, really. We don't need to spend too long on those. In fact, we'll go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and we'll just blur that in a little bit as well. So maybe about 5%, just to soften any shapes we've now created. Go back to that layer, tap on it and turn off the alpha lock, and then do the same thing again. So back to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and just soften some of those edges by blurring that a little bit. You don't need to do too much. About 4% is enough, and then deselect. And we've just got a smattering of cloud now, just to make the background not completely devoid of anything, so it's not just a blank background. Going to go to our layers and create a new layer, layer 4. Go to our colors, and while we've used all the top colors, now we're going to start creating some foliage for the upper area of the tree. We're going to start with the 1st color on the middle row, and I'm going to go back to my brushes, and I'm going to use the organic rainforest brush. Now I've changed it, so I'm going to reset it, and I'll show you the changes. So I'll go back onto the brush by tapping it, and I'm going to change the spacing from 27%, where it's all kind of clumped together. I'm going to space it more, maybe it's about 45%, and you can see that it's just created more gaps between the kind of clumping of the texture, and then click done. So with the rainforest brush, I'm going to set it quite low, maybe 2% size, 100% opacity, and well, we're going to just create some lumps of this texture. Now you can't see it very clearly, perhaps in some places it's going to appear quite light. In other areas it'll contrast with the color that is the background. For here example, it's going to look a little bit darker, and here it's going to look lighter. So we just want to create clumps of this. I'm happy for it to go off the edge of the canvas. I'm just circling this in. It's kind of a series of clumps and blobs that all group together. And really, I only want to affect this, largely this upper area. So just be mindful of that. And I'm okay to leave some gaps here and there as well. Perhaps I'll put the size up a little bit, maybe just nudged into the 3%. And I do want to leave some gaps. I don't want to completely blot out all of the blue background. I think it's important that we leave some remaining. And we can bring it down so that it comes down maybe about 2/3 of the way down in areas. But then as it starts to come sort of further down in places, perhaps the gaps need to be a little bit bigger. And much of this is only really going to make sense once we start to put in the branches and the tree details and change the tone of this. So just trust what we're doing a little bit. We will get there. So as we get towards the center, maybe we can just have a bit more of a concentration. It makes sense. It's going to be the outer edges where it gets a little bit thinner in places. But as we get towards the center, we've got more of a concentration. Okay, so I'm then going to go to that layer, slide and duplicate it. And it just really makes some of the edges slightly less fuzzy. And then I can just pinch them together again, which is a bit tricky. If you struggle with this, tap on the top version, merge down. I'm going to tap on that layer and put on the alpha lock. Then I'm going to change color. We're going to go for the 2nd color on the middle row. I'm going to use the rainforest brush still, but I'm going to turn it down to the 2% again. think probably about 30% should do. And I'm going to introduce some of this darker texture, this darker color rather, perhaps over on this side. Now, part of the effect I'm going for is that when we get close to the sun, it really shines through the leaves and create a kind of really luminous effect. But we're not going to get this so much over at this side because it's further away from the sun. I'm just circling in the texture, and you can see now it's really creating this kind of look of particles that I suppose kind of represents the foliage, the individual leaves. I could just go over this with an airbrush and just really flatten it out, but I want to preserve some of this texture. We have other means of adding texture in as well. I just think if we start with a nice texture, then it can only get better from that point. Just a little bit time consuming, just going over some of these areas, that's all. And that's fine. Now another trick that we can do, perhaps, is we can go to a new layer, tap on it and put on the clipping mask. And now that links it with a little arrow, you can see, to the layer below. So it does effectively the same thing. So I can do it again in this area. It looks exactly the same, but it is on a separate layer. So if I want to get rid of it, then I can do. So I'll continue now on layer 5 with the clipping mask on. I think as I come over to this side, that's going to be especially important. I can erase it, reduce it, and just make it slightly less significant compared to this side. And you can see I'm just circling it in. I'm not really taking any particular care with this. It really is just about building up texture. And also, because we have the rainforest brush, which is very textural too, you don't notice the scribbles, the lines of the scribbles so much either, which is great. So I'll go along to the third color and keep it at the 2% size, keep it at 30% opacity, and I really want to concentrate some of this darker color over at this side, so I'm employing the same technique. I might as well stay on layer 5 for this. And perhaps just allow it to be a little bit more sporadic. I don't want this to be absolutely everywhere, uniformly. Think about where the sun is. It's going to be up in this kind of corner a little bit more, so certainly around this kind of curve, we're going to have a little bit more of the darker colours coming in. Perhaps we can just flatten out some of this area, just scribble more intensely over some of this. Even up here as well. And then we have it a little bit more broken. And then finally, it just doesn't appear up here. The darkest colour won't appear in that area. And that's starting to building quite a nice look, I think. Perhaps I'll change to a more vibrant colour. So we can go for the 5th colour. Skip this really dark colour for now. We'll go to the 5th colour. And same setting, so I've still got it at 2% size, 30% strength, opacity. Maybe I can just start ramping up some of the brightness over at this side now, so it has the opposite impact. I don't want to completely flatten this out at this stage. Again, just kind of scribbling, circling in, introducing more light from that edge. Until we get to about the center point, and then we can allow it to trail off. Maybe just concentrate on those edges, perhaps. Almost going around the very edge of some of those shapes. So we have a clump and then an edge of that clump that faces this way a little bit more. I think actually we could probably merge those two layers now. Again, that's tricky. So tap on the top version, merge down. I'm quite happy with that overall texture. I think that is working pretty well. Tap on it, you can see the alpha lock is still on. I'm going to go to the airbrushing, soft brush, and I'm going to go for maybe the 4th color on the top row, 5% size, 10% opacity, and then maybe just in this area, there's a suggestion or an idea that perhaps some of this foliage is higher up at the very top end of the tree, and therefore it's just going to make some of those darker colors a little bit kind of more blue, a little bit lighter because of just a hint of kind of atmosphere. Now it's difficult to explain that, but these bits are going to be almost lower down, closer to us, and then the bits that are higher up are going to follow the tree trunk up into this area. So we're just subduing them slightly, making them slightly more distant feeling. So that will do for the beginning of that texture. I'm going to slide and duplicate it again. And on the top version, I'm going to go to the adjustments. I'm going to go on noise, and I'm going to slide the noise along to about 40%. And then the scale also up to 40%, which is pretty ugly. It's kind of really dominated and destroyed most of what we've got, and that's fine for now because we have it on a separate layer. It's very tricky to get it at the 40%, but there you go. 39 will do, as long as it's close to 40%. I'm going to put the octaves, well, let's put them on max, and then turbulence, put that on max as well. Deselect. Now, it's pretty brutal, and I don't like the look of that, but we can go to that top layer, tap on the N, and we can just turn the impact of that down, and we can put it exactly where we want it. So it goes a long way, even when it's a little bit. So there it is with nothing. And if we just tweak it a little bit, even at sort of 10, 15%, it just brings extra noise into the scene. So I think 20 is pushing it a little bit far. 15%, I think, just adds a little bit more turbulence, a little bit more information in there. And you can see the difference. And I actually prefer the look of it with the noise feature on. Okay, so we're going to create a new layer, layer 6. We're going to go to the airbrushing. We'll go for the medium hard brush, go back to our colors, and I'm going to use this color, which is the first color on the bottom row, and we're going to map in where the tree is going to go. I'm going to put the size about 3% and 100% opacity, and I'm just going to start with the bottom edges. Once we get to about this point, and we can have maybe a branch just steering off the edge. It has to get gradually sort of thinner once we get up to this area and this point. Perhaps we can just drag into the remaining gap. Now it's on a slider, so just make sure that you don't let go of the Apple Pencil. Put it at the correct place. I'm going to keep it as one opacity just to begin with, or one color rather. Have a series of branches, and they can go off the top of the canvas. I'm absolutely fine with that. Now I'm just doing the thickest of branches at this point. We probably need to change to the Studio Pen in order to have the really fine branches. So we're just doing the thicker ones, and then we'll do some fine branches from these afterwards. So once you get to a point where you know it's going to have to really be thinning down as a branch, then you can just stop and we'll use a different brush. That'll do initially. Like I say, then we're going to switch to the inking Studio Pen. I'm going to put the size maybe at 20% and 100% opacity. And then with these branches, well, we can just have them trailing off, and it's pressure sensitive, so it doesn't really change the opacity, but it does change the scale. So you press on lightly, you're still going to get a very dark or full version of the color, but it will change the scale. So you can trail it off, you can get finer and finer branches, which is exactly what we need for this scene. It's perfect for just going in there and just creating branches that just splinter off from the main branches. Now it's important you add some angles into these branches. It can't just be all sweeping curves. It's okay to make some of these shapes a little bit uglier, more angular. I think that you're going to get a mix of those different shapes in any tree. So I would resist trying to make it sort of too pretty and too curvy. I think that's not going to look quite as natural. So you want some uglier kind of bends and angles in there as well. I don't find them ugly, but I'm just trying to think of ways of just conveying the meaning. Less curvy. Okay, so we've got some element of the tree in there. We don't really get a sense of the perspective yet. It just looks a little bit odd, and that's fine. Create a new layer, and we'll tap on it and we'll put on the clipping mask again, so it links to that layer, and we're restricted when we get to the edges. It won't go over the edges, but it means it's also on a separate layer, which can be very useful. So I'm going to move along to the third color. Again, I'm going to go back to the airbrushing soft brush. I'm going to use maybe about 2% size and about 20% opacity, and just think about where the sun is coming from and where it's likely to catch the edges. I think you can understand that the sun's coming from here, so it's going to catch the left side of the branch when it is facing it, or just sort of touch the edge of this side too. And we just take each branch on that basis. So a branch by branch basis, we're just trying to add a highlight in an appropriate area. We don't need to worry too much about this. We can go over much of this with a dark color too. So if you feel like you've overdone the highlight, then I wouldn't worry about it too much. It's easy to rectify. We'll just start with the branches to begin with, and then we'll get to the tree trunk a little later. Now some of these might be slightly more in shadow. I'm going to turn the size of that brush down to 1%, just so I can really control those edges a little bit more. And like I said, some of it might be in shadow, so it might be more subtle anyway. You don't see as much. There's no harm in just generally getting it in place to begin with. I'm going to go back over with the shadow and reclaim some darker areas. But yeah, just helping us understand that the forms of it with the highlight is very useful anyway. So that's further enhanced our sense of the shape. I'm going to go along to, well, a much further along colour, so the 7th colour. Put the brush up to 3%, maybe down to about 10% opacity. And then just in the centre of these branches, I'm going to start bringing in a darker tone. In fact, I'm going to turn it up from 10. I'm going to put it up to 20. Be a little bolder, but maybe down into the 2% size. And we're just generally aiming for the middle part of these branches, and I'm going to concentrate more on the ones that are just getting a little bit bigger. Don't care too much about the texture at this point. I'm just getting the dark tone through the center of that branch. Maybe turn it down even further into the 1%. Enables me to kind of get in there in the fine branches too. Just whack it in the middle there as much as you can. Don't care too much about the texture at this point. I'm just getting the dark tone through the center of that branch. Maybe turn it down even further into the 1%. Enables me to kind of get in there in the fine branches too. Just whack it in the middle there as much as you can. Again, we can always go back over this and refine this further. But initially, let's not waste any time. Let's just get in there and put that darker tone as neatly as we can without spending too long on it and agonizing over it. Just aim for the middle. Doesn't matter if it's a bit clumsy and it doesn't quite land where it should. But as long as you keep aiming roughly for that center area, then it'll build up that effect. And you can start to see it really building in a bit more of a 3D look. I'm going to move along to maybe the 5th color on the bottom row. Still with a soft brush with an airbrushing, still on the same layer. I'm going to put 3% size, 20% opacity, and then I'm just going to begin building in this kind of nice blue tone as it comes further down. In fact, I'm going to put that up to 5%. And we'll build it down into the main body of our tree. And then as it comes up into this area, we can turn it down again to the 2%, and it's just going to feed off to the edges once we get up to a certain point. So you can see it more dramatically at this juncture, this point. We can also add the blue, perhaps at this side of that branch. So it's almost like a secondary light source. So we've got the kind of dark tone, we've got the light tone, and then we've got this sort of secondary blue tone. Or blue tone, you know, affected by a secondary light source anyway. And we'll bring this further down into this area. Again, I don't care about neatness. It's not really relevant at this point in the tutorial. Go over it a fair bit. And then I'm going to switch, go back to the 4th color, and I'm going to introduce a really light, vibrant color on this side of the tree. Just at the edge initially. Turn it down. 2% size, so I can really start to control it now. And again, this is going to be used to ramp up the highlighted edge in some places. Not everywhere. And even now, you can start to see more of that impact. We're going to add more foliage here that is going to be more low-lying, and it's going to make even more sense of it. But for now, we're starting to really building a good look. I'm going to take some curves. I'm going to start sort of bending them this way. So just in essence, it's going to be like this, which obviously describes the shape of the tree trunk, but also is bringing out a sense of the texture on the tree as well. This is very much like a silver birch tree, which you get sort of strips that will peel away and just creates a really nice texture all the way up and down the tree trunk. And then once we get up to these points, I wouldn't worry too much about that texture. We're really only going to notice it this dramatically on the lower sections, but you get an idea. And again, we can switch back to the blue, which is the 5th color. And well, we can continue that texture with the blue as well over at this side. And again, we can't go beyond the edges, so we can, do this without worrying about the neatness at that edge, which is really useful for this type of a subject matter, where you want to be freer with the texture. You want to respect that boundary in that edge. Again, just think about the secondary light that is following some of these branches. Perhaps there could just be a little bit of it in here as well, on this edge that's facing away from the brighter sun area. But that also means we need to go back. Perhaps we'll try the 3rd color on the bottom row, and we need to amplify some of that brightest edge, perhaps in places too. Okay, I'm going to create a new layer, layer 8. I'm going to go in with the airbrushing medium hard brush, go back to my colors, and I'm going to use the 6th color along on the bottom row, low on the 2% size and maybe about 80% opacity strength. I'm going to tap on it and put on the clipping mask again. So again, it's just linked to this layer. So it means when we add texture at the edges, it won't go beyond the outlines. So I'm going to start at the edge. I'm going to create a series of taps, clusters, and keep it quite scruffy. And then I can have other bits that just sort of join in with it with a neater line as well. And we're doing a combination of neater kind of lines and then kind of more gnarly looking scribbled in texture as well. Perhaps the opacity is a little bit strong. We'll put it down to 60, be a bit more forgiving. We can build up this effect rather than going straight in there. So we're going to get some sections of the tree trunk where it's all kind of messy texture like this, and then other bits where we've just got a nice stripe that cuts across and through some of the areas. So again, following the general curve. And then maybe I'll put it down to just into the 1%, zoom in a little bit, so it can be a bit more refined as well. Bring in some lines that cut through here. And then we can go to those lines and then just again add some of these darker kind of shapes that just disrupt that look as well. And then as we get to this edge, we'll curve that around. And what we probably need to do is, well, let's turn off the alpha lock. Let's try that, or rather the clipping mask. Let's turn it off. And that allows us just to make some of these edges a little bit more 3D, doesn't it? Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So we can start by having some lumps that sort of stick up, and then we can bring the line this way. And I think that's actually more effective. We are adding more refined details, so we don't need to be quite as free with the texture. Therefore, the clipping mask doesn't make as much sense, does it? Now we're just building some of these lines as they cut further up as well. Doesn't matter if they overlap, if they become dashes and sections. The more we keep building it up, the better the effect is going to get. We can rotate it if the kind of natural flow of your gesture, your hand is more comfortable. Like this, it's very bit awkward to do it in this position really. Prefer to do it off to the side, so that's fine. Rotate the canvas. You can just create some of these stripes, these strips that just cut across. We can layer this up. We can go back over with the highlights where necessary as well. And if you get any kind of clumsy overlap of some of these textures, we'll just go in there and add another kind of darker, more of a blob. We want plenty of these in this texture anyway. It's very much an important part of this tree bark look. So you don't need to overly worry about being neat either. There will be a sense when we get further down that we just get slightly fewer of these stripes, and that's fine. So as we get further down, maybe just be a little bit more considered to make them count a little bit more. So I'm just adding a few kind of random dots, dashes, a clumping of blobs and texture, so I'm curving it around with the shape of the tree. Now we're using this colour here, but there's no reason why we can't switch to different colours. So we've got this colour, the 7th colour, which is more of a brown kind of colour. Well, obviously brown. But then we've also got a really dark colour, this black colour as the 8th colour. And we can use that to really ramp up, especially as it comes further down towards us. We can really ramp up the darkness of this colour as well. And we'll just alternate. So I'm going to go back to the 7th colour. I think it's the... So I'm going to go back to the 6th colour. I think it's probably the best overall colour. We have this on a separate layer. We can always go back in and affect the look of this colour. It's an independent part of the image, so we don't need to worry about ruining the rest of the image if we were to change the saturation or the hue. I'm just going to continue moving across the tree trunk, adding more of these bits of texture. And then there are some bits where it just becomes a bigger kind of split in the bark and more kind of gnarly lumps in there as well. It's only on the 1%, so we can really go in there and be a bit more refined. This texture is going to be further exaggerated and amplified if we go to the 4th colour. And from this edge, we're going to bring in some of the highlights and bring them in from that edge. And this is going to be an important part of the overall look as well. So we can bring some stripes in from that edge. Keep zooming out just to check that it's working. I think that's starting to work quite nicely. We can build up the highlight even stronger. Allow it to clump together in large blocks in some areas too. Think about some of these shapes. So it might be that the highlight just runs along here and just cuts along the top edge and respects some of the textures you've already added. So the highlights and the shadows and the darker shapes kind of have to connect to each other, have to interplay a little bit. Otherwise it doesn't make very much sense. Add highlight on top of the shadows or the darker tones where necessary. I'm going to put the size of that brush up just into the 2%. As we get further down here, we're going to get bigger bands of this lighter texture cutting across. And then back down again as we go further up. We don't need to get into anything like as much detail when we get further up, but we do need suggestions of it. It can't just be devoid of that sort of texture up here. If it's represented in one part, it kind of needs to be treated similarly up in these higher areas too. So perhaps we need to go back to that 6th colour and think about some of these darker shapes up here as well. Some of these kind of gnarly lumps and bands that cut across. And again, follow the shape of the branch. So we're going to create a kind of curve like this. It's going to help describe that form. And you can see, because now we've got it here and it carries up here, it really unifies the different areas of the tree branches together better. You don't need to spend overly long on the textures up in this upper area, but you definitely need to have suggestions of it at the very least. I think that's the right word to use as well. It is just a suggestion of it compared to down here. And it brings it together. And bend it round here. And then again, we're going up into this area. You don't need to do all the little dashes that you do in the lower area, but you certainly need like the bigger, darker, more obvious shapes there to be noticeable as you go further up. And again, this looks a little bit kind of clumsier zoomed in, but once you start to really just take in the overall impression of the image, then it can work fine. Now you can spend as long as these images as you obviously want, just getting to the point where they look convincing enough, create the illusion, create the effect, and then sometimes that's most of the work on a piece of work anyway. And then you can spend as much time as you want refining. And I do love the refinement stage. It's something that I can get very easily obsessed with, which is why we try to avoid too much of that on the main tutorial. Otherwise we'd never end. And I think we'd all get pretty bored after about an hour and a half. So yeah, just continue this suggestion up into the branches a little bit. Less concentrated than in the lower areas, and we need to extend this across the highlights into the darker area obviously, but also into the highlighted areas in some places, otherwise it's going to look strange. And we get these junction points where it cuts across all the areas perhaps at once. Have a concentration of these splits in the bark perhaps. Can bring it all together there a little bit. There's no precise way to place these. I wouldn't try to replicate exactly where I've put some of these textures. I think just finding your own way with the shapes that you've got. Definitely a little bit of trial and error with these, and that's fine. I might even switch to something like the organic rainforest brush. Same settings as before. I'm going to turn it down to the 2% size, 70% opacity. And where we could trial this, it's got an interesting texture. There's no reason we couldn't use various brushes. I think that the soft airbrush is fine, but it can be a little bit too clear on the edges, whereas this is a useful way just to obscure and just further kind of obscure some of those obvious lines and brush marks, create an interesting look. I wouldn't try and do all of it with that though, because it can be a little bit fuzzy, a little bit almost furry. We'll go to the 7th color, a lighter color in the mix there. So again, this can be useful. Perhaps we'll go to the 6th color again, I prefer that. Again, we can use that just to create more of a grain, but I wouldn't over rely upon this. So a mixture of the two I think can work. Back to the airbrushing, medium hard brush. I can go in there and just refine this a little bit. Create a line that cuts through more distinctly. Give it the sharp edges where it needs it in places, because it does. So the disadvantage of that brush is that it doesn't give you a crisp edge or line in any areas at all. So the combination of the two I think can work. I'm going to switch to the blue, the 5th color. I'm going to put the opacity on max, 100% and 2% size. And I'm just going to bring some of this blue texture across here as well. And it's pressure sensitive, so you can press on a little less. We're going to bring some of these areas a bit more blue back in here. I think it makes sense. Maybe reduce down some of this. Looks a bit too much. It's finding the right balance. Break it up a little bit more. Go back in with maybe the 3rd color. Actually the 4th color. I'm going to go back to layer 7. I'm going to go in with the 6 colour still, soft brush with an airbrushing, 2% size, maybe 40% strength. And I think I'm just going to build in some more darkness here. Some of these tree branches I think need to be just a greater contrast. I feel like I want them to just stand out a little bit more. And then I'm going to go to the top layer, create a new layer, layer 9. I'm going to create some more foliage here that's going to cut in front of some of these branches and just be larger foliage as well. So we are going to use the organic rainforest, but we're going to tap on it and we're going to change the spacing to maybe 60%. Click done. I'm going to go to perhaps the 6 color on the middle row, 5% size, 100% opacity. And well, I'm just going to create some blocks of foliage that are going to be clumps that are just a little bit more spaced out. So I do a clump here, clump there, maybe another clump in this area here, and it's just going to be foliage that's closer to us. We don't want to completely destroy everything we've got, but it needs to cover up the branches in areas. And we could have some that just cuts in front up here as well. Maybe we could even put it slightly larger, 7%. And this is just like a base of brighter color. Then we'll go along maybe to the end color, 10th color on the middle row. And then we'll just create some more on top, just to kind of subdue those a little bit. So they're not going to disappear, but they're going to be placed slightly more background again. And then we can go maybe to the second color on the middle row again. And these now are just going to cut in front more distinctly and just slightly obscure them. They're going to be lower down. They're going to be more obvious kind of leaf shapes, although they don't look very clear yet. But we could go in there and just further define them a little bit too. Create more of a cluster up here, for example. More over here. And in here. Not too much there, perhaps. A bit more light. I guess we can go over it with a soft brush though. So let's just add it in first. We can always subdue it. And that's creating the illusion of leaves that are a little bit closer to us. We can always go back in with the airbrushing soft brush, or even the airbrushing medium hard brush, in fact. 2% size, maybe 60% strength, opacity. And well, we can just further sharpen up some of these leaves, make them a little bit more distinct. I'm not looking to get in there with specific leaf shapes, but we can just create slightly bulkier look for these more distinct edges where it's necessary, just to build up that effect. We can go to that layer slide and duplicate it, and that will help. And again, we can go in there and just further define some of these leaves if it's necessary, which it probably will be, and that's fine. So some bigger shapes over at this side, maybe over here, smaller ones generally. I think I'll merge them two together, or tap on the top one and merge down. Then tap on it and put on the alpha lock. Go to the soft brush with an airbrushing, and I think I'll go for the, well, maybe the 7th color on the middle row. 10% size, 10% opacity, and I can just go in there and slightly subdue, bring in the impact of that sun over at this side a little bit more again. And I hope now you can appreciate there's a sense that these are closer to us than some of the slightly more misted out and blued foliage that we see in the center area. It was something I was trying to describe earlier. Very difficult to describe it in words, but I'm hoping that it becomes a little bit more apparent at this stage. Perhaps go back to layer 8, create a new layer above layer 8, but underneath layer 9, and that gives us the opportunity to go in and out of some of those areas and create more branches. So we'll go in with the inking studio pen, and then go for something like the 7th color. Sorry, no, it's the 6th color, isn't it, on the bottom row? We'll have it at 20% size, maybe 50% strength. Add into areas where we've already got branches. We can darken them up as well if necessary, just to really create a nice illusion of branches going behind leaves. And again, it's pressure sensitive, so if you release the pressure, you get a thinner line. And these branches will just cut in and out of some of these foliage areas now really nicely. going to spend a bit longer on the texture down here. So we can go back to layer 8. Going with the soft brush, we'll go for the 6 color along, 2% size, 70% opacity. And again, we'll just maybe unify some of these shapes, bring some stripes that kind of connect them together. Just take a little bit more care now. Bring them across. Especially as we come down into these closer areas, we just need to take a little bit more care with it. Turning down into the, just into the 1%. And little dots, smaller dashes. And perhaps also important to leave some bigger gaps between some of these lines, because as it gets closer to us, it's going to become a little bit more dispersed and spaced out. You'll notice the gaps get stretched out a little bit more. And just press lightly on this edge as well. Bring them in right at the very edge. We haven't got the alpha lock on anymore. We don't need it, or the clipping mask even. Just take a little bit of care along that edge. Now, it's fine when you're doing bigger textures to be a bit more free, and the clipping mask is appropriate, but when we're adding little bits of refinement and now anyway, then just go a bit more carefully. Larger streaks all the way across can be quite useful too. Then don't forget the highlight, we'll go for the 4th colour. And well, we can use some of the textures now to guide us. Cut along the top edge of some of these. We can have large blocks of highlight too, that's absolutely fine. But just it can just kiss some of those shapes there as it creeps the highlight around a little bit. Not too much. Bring the highlight up into the upper areas, obviously. Not uniformly everywhere, but some of those branches definitely need some strong highlights on them. Now we're going to have dappled light cutting through as well because of the foliage, naturally. Again, just creep some of these highlights around the edge a little bit towards the center. Not too much, but certainly some. Put it up a little bit, 2%. Then I'm going to go for the blue, 5th color. We have a middle area now where we just need a bit more of that blue. So we can just build in that more. So we're still got at the 2% size, still at 70% strength. Let's build that blue in a little bit more. I do like the overall look of that colour. Notice I do a lot of zooming out just to check, and then zoom it back in again. It's a very important part of the process. So I say it quite a lot in my tutorials, but that's how much I think it's an important technique. And then back to the highlight, maybe the 3rd colour. We'll just have a merging off point of between the blue and the highlight there. Go for the black, and we come further down here, and there's every reason to have just a few more of these closer to textures really coming into play. It's very, very dark, that black, so we'll alternate that and the 6th colour. Perhaps I'll start with the 6th colour and then go back to the black. Choose the size, 1%, and then again, just some smaller little blobs dispersed throughout as well. And it's, I think, starting to bring that texture together quite nicely. Okay, on the top layer, I'm going to create a new layer, layer 11. I'm going to go in with the soft brush within airbrushing. I'm going to use the 6 color on the bottom row still. 2% size, maybe 40% strength. And there's some of these branches, I just think could be made a little bit stronger, perhaps an even lower 1% size, just in the center of some of these. We don't want to completely destroy the highlights that maybe just clip along the edge, but I do want to make some of the impact of these a little bit stronger. So I want to make the branches darker perhaps, whilst also preserving some of the highlights. A bit of a tricky thing to do, but we could also add more branches. Why not? Add a bit more complexity, look around our scene, see anywhere where it just needs to be a little bit ramped up. If it does, a little bit darker, maybe some branches that are showing through, and just a little bit of fine tuning here and there, I think. We've got a bit of a branch here that just didn't amount to very much. We could just justify its existence now with a couple of finer kind of twigs and branches coming from it. I think we kind of overlooked that one. It's easy to do. It was quite a light color initially, so we did kind of forget about it, but there you go. We've kind of given it a reason to exist. Now, something we can do with the overall image, once you're generally happy with it, is we can go to the wrench, the add, copy canvas, and then paste. Now, you probably can't see that until we go to the thumbnails, and you can see now at the very top, in the thumbnail, we've got a whole version of that. I can see that this is the case because if I long press on that, it makes all of the other layers invisible, and I untick that and you can see everything is now on one layer. Press and hold, it puts everything back. On this top layer, I'm going to go to the adjustments, the liquify, and on the push, I'm going to put it pretty big, so maybe like 75%, 100% pressure, and I can now play around with the curve of the tree. Now it might be that you just didn't like the overall thickness of something, so you can pinch it in. So you create more of a gradual change of shape, and everything's organic here, so it doesn't matter if you push it around a little bit. It's not going to fundamentally ruin anything, but you can certainly push it and stretch it and just play around with the idea of the shape of this tree. And you can certainly have fun with it, and it's all on a separate layer, so it's not destructive to anything else. So I can show you the original, I can show you my more amended version, and I do think that actually there's some mileage in kind of pushing it around, playing with it and seeing what actually can be done through that distortion. I think I do prefer the distorted version, so that's going to be my final version. So on that note, I'm going to leave this tutorial here at this point. I hope you've enjoyed following along. I may well push this a little bit further in a few days over at my Patreon page, so if you want to be involved in that, then go to my Patreon, that is linked down in the video description. You'll also find a link to a new project that I've taken on with Joel Creates. It's a combined channel, it's more of a podcast style where we talk all things art. So do join us, join the discussion. Again, the link for that is down in the description. Other than that, please give this video a thumbs up, it really helps out the channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done already, and I shall see you back here soon. Bye for now.